friends, welcome to Unearthing, our chats with organizers, leaders, and teachers about the powerful tools they're creating to build justice. I'm Nico Chin, founder of Up With Community. We help people learn better together. Today, we're talking about housing rights and the connections of how we build our houses to how we save our earth. Our podcast is made possible by our supporters on Patreon and PayPal. You can help us create more content at upwithcommunity.org/support. I am excited to be sitting down today with Naomi Beal, director and founding member of passivhausMAINE. passivhausMAINE is a regional professional organization of architects, builders, and designers of the Passive House Standard. Naomi, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks very much, Nico. Happy to be here.
Thanks. Well, I wanted to start things off by asking you to tell us a little bit more about what Passive House design standards are.
Sure. And on a sort of very elemental level, the standard is comprised of three different precise metrics. There's an air tightness standard, which is 0.5 ACH50. I don't know how much detail we want about that, but 0.5 ACH50, I can get more into what that really means for people who don't know later. For air tightness, the amount of energy used for heating or for cooling is 4.75 kilowatts per square foot per year, a very specific number. And then for total energy use in a building, it's limited to 38 kilowatts per square foot per year. So just to say, all of those numbers are very small and relative to a sort of average building that we have, let's say in Maine, they are about 10 or 15% of what we would see in an average building.
So the idea is by making houses more effective in their air tightness, in their energy use, that we are conserving energy in the heat of the homes. And is there other dynamics that we're looking for in the Passive House standards?
Certainly the heat and the carbon and costs associated with that is one of the driving factors. In addition, though, there's also a whole air quality interest that's part of that. There's fresh air, always part of a passive house that creates a really healthy indoors, which has great, the side effect of being a really healthy indoors for people. There's a resiliency that's inherent in building a building that is airtight and well insulated, that creates a future proofing for our extreme weather. And that's a whole like low carbon tracking for a building is part of that. Yeah.
Great. So we're trying to reduce the carbon footprint of the houses that we're building.
Yeah.
And so just help me understand, I don't want to go too far down this hole, but how do you do both fresh air and air tightness?
Yeah.
In general.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to answer that, because it's a stumbling place for a lot of people. And it's true. When you build to passive house level or retrofit in an airtight kind of way, focusing on air tightness, you have to include then ventilation. And that's a mechanized system that's totally controlled. And so different from how most of us grew up. If we grew up in drafty New England homes, we sort of, we all absorb this wisdom that buildings need to breathe. And potentially buildings do need to breathe. If they're getting wet and moldy, they need to be able to dry out freely through the walls. And that's what our drafts are. In a passive house scenario, the walls don't get wet. There's no leaking. It's airtight and watertight building. And so you put in ventilation that removes the old air and brings in fresh air. And often that air is sort of preheated. There's a whole, heat recovery system that's part and parcel with that.
Is that the same as a heat pump, or would that be different?
It could be different.
Yeah.
Heat pumps are heating. they're not bringing in fresh air, to be really
Got
clear. Yeah, no, absolutely. There are ventilation systems that have a little bit of preheat that's part of that, but a heat pump itself is not bringing in any new fresh air to the building. Yeah.
So passive house standards are about building houses that are better for our environment. And it sounds like better for our health.
Yeah. And in fact, that's been an interesting sort of game of catch up. The original standard, passive house standard, was designed and evolved in Europe,
Mm.
where they have different kind of building materials. And so building material, when we started doing passive house and stretching to those three metrics that I mentioned earlier, pretty often and still we use materials that were digging our carbon hole much deeper than maybe some European products did. So when we use all of those petroleum-based insulation and spray foams and steel and glass, sometimes using those materials was really digging us into a deeper carbon hole. So there's a sort of evolving understanding of what kind of materials we do need to use when we're giving the nod to carbon reduction and embodied carbon in a building.
Yeah. So passive house standards are calling us to help address climate change, to make more resilient buildings, and to make buildings that are healthier for us. How did you get into founding Passive House Maine, and what brought you to these standards?
So my story is a little bit through the back door because I started as a photographer. I was doing portfolio work for architects.
Wow.
And I just realized that the designers that I was most interested in working with were working on these really cool buildings. Like 10 years ago, it was like, wow, what are you doing? It was all new and kind of mission based in a way that some of the other buildings that I was taking photographs of were not. And I just was drawn to these at that point sort of few designers who were doing this really cool work. And then I had the opportunity my family took the opportunity to do a sabbatical in Germany in it was 2009, 2010. It was really quite a long time ago at this point. And I was still taking pictures there, but it was passive house everywhere all the time. And there were major, neighborhood developments that were fully passive house. Every building, every apartment building, every retail outlet, every school, every medical building, everything was built to passive house. So when I came home in 2010, I was like, all right, at that point I had a lot of connections just because of the photography work that I was doing earlier, and I sort of pulled together a group and we're like, come on, let's get this going.
So what do you hope communities in Maine will gather from Passive House Maine? How would you like to see communities benefit from Passive House Maine?
The really important work that Passive House Maine is working on right now is our research initiative called Retrofit Maine, which is about the retrofit of existing buildings. New buildings are certainly very important, and we definitely want to be building all of our new buildings to the highest possible standard so that we're not in the position of having to retrofit them 20 years from now. Building new buildings is relatively the lighter lift for passive house. Like, we know how to do that. We have the materials to do that. We should be doing that. It's understood. Retrofits, however, are really a challenge. And there are 500,000 units in Maine that need attention for resiliency, for carbon reduction, for cost reduction. I was going to say, I'm worried about Mainers right, this year, who have this combination of higher energy bills because fuel has suddenly skyrocketed in price. If you could magically insulate every building, put in some ventilation, and offset all of the existing energy needs with solar or some other renewable, we'd be in a really good spot. And that's what Retrofit Maine is striving to understand how to do these, what we would call a deep energy retrofit, a systemic approach to updating all of our old buildings to, as a path for our low carbon future. Maine has a three extremes. We have the oldest building stock in the country, we have the oldest population in the country, and we have the highest proportional number of households that are heated with number 2 heating oil in the country. So if there's any place in the US anyway that deserves and needs and would benefit from a concerted attention to retrofits, it's Maine. And just to put a plug for Retrofit Maine, we were just recognized at COP26 by the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe for our work in the area of retrofits, and for this very reason. Maine's buildings are small, they're underbuilt and wooden, and we need to learn how to retrofit them. We really don't know right now. It's so expensive.
Congratulations on
Thank
that
you.
recognition. That's important work. You know, as you're talking, I'm hearing in my ear something I heard as I was researching your work prior to our conversation, which was, housing is a human right. And a lot of times when we talk about housing as a human right, we think about it just as any house.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't think about how do we push for housing as a human right for healthy, resilient, climate positive, climate supportive housing as a part of that call, right?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of times there's a class dynamic to that. Like, oh, only fancy people get fancy houses that make them healthy, And it's like,
yeah,
and I don't think that we can demand those things for everyone. Yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
I do think we can demand it for everyone, especially, especially right now, any affordable housing units, those big square buildings that we build, those should all 100% be built to Passive House standard. Like, there's no reason not to. There's a fairly decent cost equity there. It doesn't cost much more to build to Passive House standard. For those simple, large shapes, we know how to do that. We should be doing that. And absolutely, the work of Retrofit Maine is based on an equity approach. And that it is a case of housing equity equals climate equity equals climate justice, housing justice. It's all part of that. I mean, the extremes that we're experiencing right now and will experience more are just shine this fierce spotlight. Bad buildings are going to really suck. They already really suck. And when we get these torrential rains, fierce storms, they're going to suck more.
Driven by climate change, right? As the weather becomes more extreme.
Precisely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And our approach of weatherization it's all hands on deck right now. So I'm actually not throwing anybody under the bus. But weatherization, just used air quotes there, is just sort of undefined right now. What does that really mean for each building, and who can afford what is absolutely part of that. And just sort of to swing back to that concept of classism with Passive House, certainly in our early days when I came back in 2010, and was the only kind of Passive House that was being built in Maine, basically was somebody's kind of fancy house with a beautiful view somewhere, because those were the people that had a little bit of margin for experimentation, let's say. And it just took a while for bigger buildings, bigger building designers, bigger building funders to sort of get on board. But it created a bit of a hole that we had to dig out of, because then there was this preconceived notion that passive house was for fancy houses. And in reality, the German roots are absolutely like a large multifamily building. That their passive house was developed with this idea to support what was called energy venda, the energy change, the switch from fossil fuels in Germany to renewables. And so, yeah, it was always intended to be bigger buildings. And we have so many fantastic examples of that in Maine already, in terms of affordable housing units and our college and university dormitories. That's another perfect example of these kind of big, kind of proud, sturdy buildings, not fancy design, but if you just bake in these low cost energy bills for the life of that building, all of our colleges and universities can see that that's valuable. I mean, especially any building that you're going to hold on to for long term, there's no question about baking in, the lowest possible cost, while at the same time creating this comfortable and resilient building.
Yeah. Well, we're going to link to your organization's website, as well as a couple of other pieces that we're going to talk about today in the notes for this podcast. And so folks that are interested in getting more details on the passive house standards, on where this is happening in Maine or around the country, we'll have those links for folks to follow up on. So one of the pieces that I was eager to talk to you about, Naomi, was the equation you just talked about a minute ago, which is, housing equity equals climate equity equals housing justice, and really centering the power dynamics of our society in a conversation about the earth and our housing.
Mm-hmm.
And through our connections, I learned about the US Architects Declare Manifesto, which was inspired by a UK Architects Declare Manifesto a little while before that. And in this, US architects declare climate justice and biodiversity emergency, right? And in this, they're seeking to call for architects to be raising awareness about the impacts on the climate of their industry, to address disproportionate impacts of this crisis for low-income, rural, and BIPOC communities, and to upgrade a lot of what the industry is offering. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about your thoughts about this manifesto and manifestos like it in the push for a lot of what Passive House Maine is working on.
I mean, a manifesto is great. We should all, sign on to those. And I'm sure that I can't remember how many signed on to that. It's maybe a couple hundred, maybe.
Yep.
And that's great. It's really good. And I know there's a couple from Maine that I notice are on there. There's a bunch that are, kind of focused on carbon, especially. I guess on one hand, I think it's fantastic. Of course, we should always sign that. We should be aware of that. And every manifesto gets an opportunity for a little publicity and a little awareness. That's fantastic. And then the bottom line is you just actually also have to do the work. And it's tricky. Architects are in a funny position because they're beholden to their clients. And clients aren't necessarily they're looking at their bottom line. And there's housing and housing design and housing construction is a really entrenched and old industry that is hard to move. And so I live in a bubble where most everybody that I know is completely on board. But there's a lot of building that happens right now that is not meeting those best intentions as described in that manifesto. So it's good for publicity. We should sign on. I do believe that housing and buildings, as they are 40% of the carbon emitted globally, and in Maine, just under 40% of our total carbon emissions, they have to be an important part of the equation, an important attention focused uh, for the carbon alone. And then absolutely, people just need to be able to live in a comfortable and healthy place. It's not just because that's a nice thing to do. It's for all the reasons. It's just a healthy approach to our neighbors, to our resources, to living together in our neighborhoods and in our state.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the questions that the manifesto raised for me is, it seems like we have to have, and this, you were starting to talk about this, architects, builders, and the construction workers builders hire, all engaged along with the consumer in valuing passive house standards and climate standards for our housing. What are ways that Passive House is making inroads into that organizing across the different stakeholders in the housing market?
In passivhausMAINE, and as far as I know, all of the regional, there's regional passive house groups across the country and the world, actually. So we are actively in the conversations, a little bit in the skirmishes that we call policy making, and just trying to leverage all of the knowledge and experience that we have and that we have from our friends and neighbors to influence in a positive way policy, because honestly, the consumer will own some consumers will go above and beyond, but we really do need to have a building code that reflects what we want, and that the code combined with training. passivhausMAINE is also starting builders training to sort of get people on board in our way, as the tradition of construction in New England and in the US is, as I said, it's old and it's pretty entrenched. So certainly workforce development, workforce training is 100% part of what we need, especially when we're talking about retrofits, where there's some specialty skills that really need to be developed. And we're working on figuring out exactly what those are and how we can scale that so that we can have the impact on the existing buildings that we want. Yeah, I think more and more we see design and build firms kind of combining forces. In the old way, you would have an architect who would make a design and then you put it out to bid and see who comes back with the cheapest price or whatever for your builder. And more common with a passive house approach is having the builder and the designer in on the conversation from the very beginning. You can really identify some efficiencies in that design process and some clarity about where you're going to go and with the design, with that kind of teamwork, team designing, which is super important. Those are all pieces of that very large and complicated puzzle.
Yeah. What are some of the leading edges of the skirmishes today, and where inroads are really trying to be made for better?
We have, in fairness, we finally have rules now about the energy code needing to be updated every 3 years to synchronize with the International Building Code. That's fantastic. That's new as of last June. Like, it's that new. So that's great. And that will have some serious impact on the new building. There's a lot of focus on building code and the new stuff because of it's been so long. The last code that we just switched from was from 2009. So people have been building to this 2009 code for too long. And now this shift, there's some worry that builders won't know how to do it and don't know how to do it. And there's some pushback about it's too fast or whatever. But in fact, a lot of our builders do know how to do it and will do it. And there's a lot of trainings. I think Efficiency Maine Trust is doing some reasonable trainings in tandem with Maine's Indoor Air Quality Council. Those are great. We have our trainings in the works. I think there's going to be a big push. This conversation about if public or affordable housing should be built to passive house standard, that certainly is for the same reasons that buildings have been developed, in a certain pattern for a really long time, and a little bit bigger upfront costs upset that known pattern of how to develop. So that's a work in progress, but I'm quite optimistic about that, insisting on, the bonus about a passive house approach or that high performance approach really is that, I don't like to use the word silver bullet, but you do just get healthier buildings with lower cost and lower carbon, and there's really no downside, really.
Yeah.
And
so besides those trainings, are there any other tips or advice you would share with communities who say, I'm interested in exploring retrofitting my house, or I want to educate myself on what I should be asking for in my community? What else would you suggest to community members that want to learn more about housing equity and climate equity in our housing justice work?
Well, I would say what we have right now is a voluntary stretch code. So we have our standard building code, which, as I said, is being updated every 3 years. On top of that, we have a stretch code, and in Portland and South Portland, if they haven't already, will shortly adopt a stretch code, which is quite close to passive house standard. Not quite, but quite close. But communities need to adopt them voluntarily. So the average community member could approach their town council or their planning board or rabble-rouse amongst themselves to bring a united voice to a town council that says, we want the best buildings. We want built to the highest quality that we could, and let's increase our community building code. Each town, the way that it works in Maine is that each town can, we have the single building code for most towns, and then voluntarily a town could bring in a higher building code so that every new building in that town would be built to a higher standard. You could rabble rouse and ask your municipality to develop the municipal buildings to a highest standard, not to a code level, not to the lowest level, because that's the cheapest way, but to a higher standard that will be a longer lasting, more resilient building and be a beacon of leadership for the rest of the community. I think this is a really important thing that municipalities can do and that Augusta should do, and I understand they are doing. There are some demonstration projects that are happening. Community members can always donate to Passive House Maine and support our retrofit research, which is going to be really important. We just give a little nod to Giving Tuesday here.
Great. I love a nod. Yeah. And tell us how people can best connect to Passive House.
www.passivhausMAINE.org. We'll have a big donate here button right there. You can find us on Instagram or on Facebook or on LinkedIn. There's a lot of ways to sort of spread, what we're doing. We're excited about that work, and I think that the individuals who want to update their own homes, I think they're in a tricky place right now because the options really are either you know how to do it on your own, and you can do your insulation or manage your contractors, or it's very, very expensive.
Yeah.
And that's a super tough trade-off that we have right now. There are definitely some weatherization programs through Efficiency Maine, um, through certain towns, and you can look that way. I'm not saying that you shouldn't do that. As I said, it's all hands on deck, whatever we can do for whatever buildings. But what we're focusing on is a systemic approach to buildings and really learning and understanding how we can do a deeper energy retrofit that will last for those 50 years, an approach that won't require another top off before 2050.
Yeah.
An approach that's just long lasting with all of those built-in cost savings, carbon savings, resiliency, and healthy living.
Yeah. Well, that's so much in line with how Up With Community approaches the world, right? We're not just about what can one individual do by themselves off alone,
Right.
but how do we come together and create systems change? So talking about building codes, talking about what we can do in these larger buildings and institutions as a beacon for what we hope to do throughout the community, really resonates with a structural approach that we take to power and equity. So Naomi, I really appreciate getting to chat with you today. You've been so generous with your time, and we'll put all of your links into the notes here. And
Great.
yeah, thank you so much for your work.
You're so welcome, Nico. Really, thanks very much for your interest and for having me on.